a few people coming in, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to let Adam start us off. We'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll get rolling. And we're gonna stop about 5 minutes before the end of the session, so we can take any of those questions that you have.
Thank you, everybody, for joining our TED Talk today. We are just coming off the implementation of our Drupal upgrade, our custom enterprise web content management system in Drupal, and kind of wanted to share some highlights of that process with you all today. I'm a manager in the web development department for KUIT, and I've been an enthusiastic Drupal user for, I guess, a decade or so now.
And my name is Chris Welchans. I'm a web developer for KUIT. I'm a front-end developer, and I've traditionally been mostly front-end design, but also user experience design. I'm very interested in designing interfaces and the user experience and trying to design for a particular audience and trying to make it the best possible experience. All right.
So kind of the 500-foot view of the presentation today. We'll just talk about what a content management system is, KU's relationship with Drupal, our use of a design system, kind of our collaborative process and tools that we used, and then how we really centered and focused our efforts on our content creators. So what is a content management system? So content management system is software used to create, modify, and deliver content, primarily useful to lower the expertise required for a writer or content creator to create web pages and websites. This kind of helps move some of the responsibility of that content creation closer to the content experts instead of the technical experts. So, some popular examples for CMSs include WordPress, Drupal, and Joomla, and then there's some other cloud-based solutions like Squarespace and Wix. And many of the common features of a CMS include built-in search, having a complete revision history, so you can see how a page has changed over time, various group-based permissions and roles, uploading files to a file system, and then driving that all via like a templating system so that all the pages are designed and fit within the same framework. A lot of the editing in a CMS is done via a WYSIWYG editor, or what you see is what you get. So this is kind of an older paradigm where we would sometimes describe this as it's as easy as typing into a Word document. And that's how I would describe the ease of using a CMS.
Yeah, and frankly, when's the last time you saw a Word document that you really looked at and you're like, wow, that is a nice Word document? So, I mean, I don't know why we use that as our example over and over, but it is pretty common. So KU and Drupal, this isn't our first foray into Drupal. KU's been using Drupal for probably since about 2012, as far as I know. So I came to KU in 2015. And I think it had been around for about 3 years before that, or as I like to refer to, 3 BC, 3 as in before Chris. So I don't know a whole lot about the first implementation of Drupal and how that went, but I know that the Drupal 7 template that we had, there were about 600 or more sites that were deployed using that template. And most of those sites are going to have to be migrated. And in fact, we're going to be moved, or we did move to Drupal 8 with this upgrade, we're going to be moving to Drupal 9 actually before even the majority of those sites have migrated, because I think we're moving to Drupal 9 very soon.
Monday is the goal.
Yeah. So very, very soon. Some of the pros about using Drupal, in case you aren't familiar with it, it's a very flexible system for developers. So what I mean is it's very flexible, it's very powerful if you have people with the skill set to actually do some of the work that it requires to make it, to really get the most out of it. It's extensible, which means that you've got modules or other plugins or things that you can use with it. If you're familiar with WordPress, they've got similar things where you can download and add on that add functionality and features. It's very stable, and in large part, the stability and the robust security are due to this very large user community. There's a very large user community that's constantly, testing it out, finding bugs, and sharing solutions for those bugs, or at least contributing back to that user community and the forums and things like that. And it's also a good system because it does use a lot of standard web stack frameworks for PHP and JavaScript. For example, it uses the Symfony framework for PHP, which is a fairly modern, fairly powerful framework for PHP, and it's actually has shipped with jQuery ever since it's been around, as far as I know, or at least since I've worked with it, it's shipped with jQuery. Now, in the future, I know that they're actually moving away from actually shipping it with jQuery to a more jQuery agnostic platform, so you can use whatever you want to do that. I've also seen some, I believe I've seen some articles too that talked about maybe some shift towards React or some of the more modern JavaScript frameworks, but I don't know exactly how true that is. So those are some of the pros, or some of the pros. Some of the cons, it is very complex. I mean, it's a more complex system than like WordPress. Okay, so when you say more complex, you're talking relative to some of these things that could be set up by a non-technical user. This is definitely not a system for non-technical users. And so that's one of the biggest things, because if you watched Jeff's keynote this morning, then hopefully one of the messages you took away from that is that time is a cost. Like, time and effort is a high cost, and that's part of what makes this a higher cost. Part of it is also the system requirements. For example, if you've ever tried to host any kind of software, you'll know that if you have to find hosting with database management capabilities, it's going to be more expensive than hosting otherwise, which those kind of things affect. If you're self-hosting, then it's a little bit different. And I think that's part of the reason why this does appeal to a lot of universities, because they have the skill set in the staff. They have the ability to self-host and to take care of some of these things. They have a lot of the resources already on hand. Just real quick, I want to run through some notable Drupal sites. The 2016 Summer Olympics, the NBA, some NFL teams, a few entertainers. We've got government websites, Government of Australia, London, New York State, US government offices. And some of you may know that actually the White House during the Obama administration used Drupal, but it was replaced with WordPress by the Trump administration. So, there's no accounting for taste, I guess. That's my personal feeling. There's other corporations. There's also large, like Fortune 500 corporations that use Drupal for their websites. And as I mentioned before, many higher education institutions. It's very appealing to the higher education institutions, I think, because of that flexibility and the ability to really really bend it to your will, if you have the people there and if you have the time to do the work. So one of the big questions going into this process was, do we move away from Drupal? In spite of the pros that I talked about, and in spite of our years of experience, do we move away from it? One of the arguments for that is using something like a static site generator. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically a tool where you can be creating content on a back end in a more dynamic way, like with a system like Drupal, but then you ultimately build out a static site that then you deploy that static site out. And some of the upside of using a static site generator are potential gains in terms of performance. If you're familiar with websites at all, you know that if you're serving static sites, typically they perform pretty well versus a site that has to load from a server, that has to go to a database and query and return pages like that. Easier site backup and recovery. Again, you're talking about just moving files around in a lot of cases. Improved security, because it's hard to hack a static page. other than to just completely replace it. It's hard to, go in and actually, a lot of the temptation, I think, on hacking some of these sites, you can go in and you can hack into a server and you can use it to spam people, or you can, take over some of the performance capabilities of that equipment. But, with static sites, it's not there. And then the lower hosting costs, if you're moving to cloud-based hosting, for example. One of the other considerations is that Drupal 8 is a major upgrade from Drupal 7. There's no easy upgrade path. In our case, frankly, that was actually a bonus, because we wanted to get people off their old sites and we wanted them to rethink how their sites were organized and maybe get a fresh start. So we did decide to upgrade to Drupal 8. And really, a couple of the big factors here were being able to leverage that wealth of experience that we had in all of our developers that have been working with Drupal 7, spending a lot of time, investing a lot of their time coming up with great solutions in Drupal for different problems and things that we could port over. And then also the relatively short turnaround. The end of life for Drupal is November 2021. And so those 600 or so sites that I mentioned earlier, that's really scary when we're looking right now at our list of how many sites have actually applied to upgrade. It's going to get to a point really soon where we're going to be starting to move people over, or their sites are going to go away. I mean, we can't, once it hits its end of life, then the security is gone.
So in this process, we opted to kind of front load our initiative by using a design system.
That's the next slide.
Oh, did I?
Oh, I'm sorry, I forwarded it on you.
You're good. Oh, gotcha. Sorry, a little thrown off. So our kind of our process, we were starting fresh. I have notes on some of our early brainstorming and discussions about this process from 2016. So it's at least 5 years in the making. We used a couple of different techniques to kind of gather information. We had surveys and focus groups, interviewed stakeholders. We knew we needed to identify the pain points in our existing CMS and avoid those if at all possible. And we did comparative research by looking at what other universities were doing and what was really working for them, and adopting those design trends. And as we built this out, we were really wanted to leverage a design system or a living digital style guide. I really became enamored with this concept when I first was introduced to it. At the time, I was very uncomfortable with my front-end development skills, and I wanted to leverage that as a platform for documenting different HTML and CSS patterns, so I could repeat the work of my more talented colleagues. So we built out a design system in Pattern Lab to document our fonts, our link styles, our button styles, and then our components, which are kind of more discrete content items like a call to action item or a card group. And in our design system, we kind of compose those together to build page templates. And that process kind of builds out into atomic design. So the design system we used was Pattern Lab. This is an open source, primarily JavaScript-based tool for rapidly prototyping and documenting patterns and HTML designs. It has support for Twig, which is the templating language that Drupal uses, and it's really focused on atomic design. So it's building bigger, more complex things out of smaller, less complex things. And here's a screenshot of our colors page. This has hex values and RGB values for all of our brand colors.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch a little bit more on Pattern Lab as we go through the rest. So this next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the collaboration, because that's one of the things that I'm probably the most proud of in this whole process. And like I said, I wasn't here for the first go round. I wasn't here for the Drupal 7 build. So I can't speak to how this compares to that as far as our working with Marcom, our marketing, KU marketing and communications. We call them Marcom, and I'm probably going to keep referring to them as that because it's going to be impossible to change my brain to say marketing and communications. But I don't know how the relationship was in that first go around with them, but I think one of the things I'm most proud of in this whole process was how we worked with them and the way the whole process was really a constant back and forth between the two teams. The two teams being Marcom and KUIT. So the next couple slides here, just really quickly, just are examples of what our cycles were. And these were cycles that were set by Marcom. But you can see if you look through some of these that they're kind of starting, it kind of follows that atomic design approach, where we started with sort of the building blocks and we built up from there. We started with just some very basic elements, like we showed you the colors example. There were also sections, for typography and for other brand elements like our divider lines. There's sections for buttons and link styles, for tables and forms. And then we got into things like page structure, and then we started getting into some more specific content types. The next few cycles were really much more about like getting into the actual content of the pages, the dynamic parts of the pages. And then some of these things like the social network information and the calendar integrations, and then things like news. So they set up these cycles, and then this kind of guided how our development went along, more or less. I mean, there's always some flex in there. The other thing I wanted to just say really quick too is that what I'm hoping to come away from this with in this collaboration piece, I'm going to walk you through like some of the different processes, and they're going to be really quick views at the process itself. But the point too, like I said, is that throughout this whole process we were working back and forth. So for example, Marcom, they design in Sketch. They're mostly a Mac shop, and we have a mix of Mac and PC among our developers. So we can't necessarily rely on Sketch. Sketch is a Mac OS app if you've never used it before. But Sketch does have a function that exports directly to this program called Zeppelin. So that's how they would deliver the designs to us. They would actually design them in Sketch and then deliver them to Zeppelin. And here's an example of what Zeppelin looks like. I meant to put some more labeling in here, but I'll just, if you can see, this row of buttons along the top, matches our cycle list. And if you click into those cycles, then you'll see how things are grouped together by those cycles according to what they had laid out as far as what they wanted to work on for those cycles. And then below it is this is one example. There's many other things. This page, scrolls forever with examples of designs. And I'll show you another example down further where you can see how each design can even have, like we'll have designs that have each different responsive screen size. And then you can drill down to that even further. So the other tool that I wanted to point out, and this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list of tools. There are some development tools. So if you're a developer and you're hoping to hear more about that part of the process, I'd be happy to talk with you or share more later. But I focus really on these two tools because of this collaboration, because of the collaborative nature of these tools. GitLab is something that you're probably, if you're a developer, you're probably familiar with it, or at least something like it. You've probably used something, whether it's Team Foundation Server. I can't remember what the one that I used back in the early 2000s. Yeah, GitHub. There's all kinds of different, essentially, and I've always thought of these as source control programs. So you're basically creating versions of your source code that have a history that you can track back, and you can find how changes have happened, and you can kind of prevent yourself from uploading bad code, things like that. It's all about the code. But really, in this particular case, we used GitLab. We did use it for the code, obviously, but this was very much a collaborative tool for us as well, because everything we did in GitLab, we shared access to our GitLab repository, especially the issue boards with Marcom, and we were constantly using it to track issues, and those issues would drive our development tasks. So here's an example of just a few of the different screens that from our GitLab, from one of our GitLab projects. This heat map up here shows somebody's activity, making contributions to the project. This down here is a chronological description of changes to different branches. And you can see the little person's icon, so you can quickly know who made a change, when they made a change. It's got a small description so you can know what was made. And then this task board is something that was extremely useful for us to manage. You can't see the labels up here, but we would have labels for things like in progress, needs review, closed, or waiting, or we might have something for a particular milestone, so that you could jump straight to those issues and look at those. There's all kinds of ways to label those issues in GitLab, but GitLab was so much more than just a source control tool. Okay, so another thing I wanted to mention was that a lot of what I'm showing you here example-wise, I'm talking a lot about GitLab and Zeppelin and those things, and so a lot of the development I'm focusing on here is more local development, like in a local development environment, where we're making the changes and then we're committing them back to the repository in GitLab, and then it's getting pushed out to production to where the other developers can pull it down to where it can be viewed in either our pattern lab site, so Marcom can go out and actually view those patterns and test them before we actually put them into a theme, into a template file for a theme. But there is also a portion of the development that happens directly in the Drupal UI. And when we get to that part later, Adam will actually talk more about those pieces in his next part. And so there is some of this that's happening there, but even in those cases, when we're developing pieces of content or entities in Drupal, we're still developing the theming for them. All the CSS, the JavaScript, and everything still goes into our repository somewhere and still gets tracked. So just real quick to run you through kind of our process of how things would happen. And again, I wanted to highlight the teamwork back and forth here. The design cycles handoff from Marcom would happen where they deliver design to Zeppelin. We typically go out to GitLab, we create issues for those. And while we're creating issues for those, and they get assigned out to a developer. The nice thing about GitLab is you can also watch issues. So if we're working with someone in Marcom about a particular issue, let's say it's not necessarily in the design cycle handoff, but a bug or something like that, they can watch that issue and we can interact with them that way. That's one of the ways we can communicate with them.
Chat threading and have discussions and.
Like here's an example. This is another example of design in Zeppelin, and this is where we're showing how we had all the different responsive sizes for a screen, how that would actually go down. And then here's where we actually drilled down into one. And when you would drill down into a view like this, one of the nice things about Zeppelin is that they actually had a function where we could turn on a grid that would correspond to Bootstrap's column grid system, which Bootstrap is another tool that we use. It's another framework that we used in this to kind of help us build our layouts. And you also there's also some automatically generated CSS that comes from Zeppelin. It's not 100% perfect, but it's good enough to sometimes like reassure you, like, is it this color or is it this color? Usually it was accurate enough in that aspect, or in the spacing, or the font type. Like if you're questioning like which font is that, so if you're trying to make sure you pick the right style for the right font type, then it was good for that. So then when the pattern development comes around, we have these weekly meetings, where we would discuss these issues and we get them assigned out. We get the patterns created. This is all happening. So we start out in GitLab with these issues. We create the patterns in our local development environment. We commit those back up to GitLab, and then that's where they can get reviewed. And we can request to be merged back into the code base, and then they can be approved or rejected. And if they're approved, then we can move on to the theme development. Here's an example now of that same Zeppelin design with a pattern that we've created that matches it. So you can see it matches it pretty close. This is being viewed. This pattern is being viewed in the browser, and that's how we would pass that around, or that's how other people might access it and refer to it. So after we get the patterns done, next comes the theme development. The difference is the theme development is actually kind of putting the patterns into action. The patterns are essentially prototypes. Now, and I say that they're prototypes in that we don't use them directly, but in some cases we do actually use parts of them directly, because all of the CSS and JavaScript that we would build into a pattern, the project that our pattern lab instance managed was our sort of our, we called it our web style guide, and it was the project that would compile all of the CSS and JavaScript from those patterns into our CSS and JavaScript main files that we would use in the finished product in the final system. So all that CSS and JavaScript that was written in any of those patterns actually was the same CSS and JavaScript that would be used in the system. But otherwise, the patterns were meant to be prototypes, and they would generate these code samples that we could then use to build the template files for the designs to actually render in the site later. And here's an example of that. You can see here where there's the twig code, and you could basically take this and copy it into a twig template file and just replace the variables that you needed to replace with the appropriate Drupal system variables, and you've got your page, or you've got your content element. So the theme development, it starts with those pattern code samples more often than not. You create twig templates, you push those back up to the project that they go with, which is a theme project, and then you deploy those changes out again, and now developers have access to them. The site has access to them. Anybody else viewing that has access to them. And then all of these processes, I kind of glossed over this part, because this is the same with all of these different processes pretty much, where we're working locally. We commit a change to this master code base repository in GitLab. The change is reviewed, it's accepted or merged, and then it moves on to testing. In the testing section of this, that's where Marcom comes back in. They did most of the testing, then most of the QA/QC, aside from what we do ourselves just in the process of building these things. But they find those things, then they go back out and they create issues in GitLab for us, and that's where they might actually tag an issue that they're watching it. And we would work on those. We could communicate them, like Adam was saying, through chat threads through there. We could also communicate with them through Slack. We had a few other tools that we also used to manage that. And then we go through the whole process again. You fix them, you deploy them again. And this is just a closer example of our task board that we had for our issue board. You can kind of see here, we just have a variety of items in here that we can go through, and we can see different. You can tell by the color coding sometimes what it's affecting, or you can tell by the labels up here, what kind of issue it is. Now I'll turn it over to Adam for his next section.
So I think one of the kind of driving principles or themes of this initiative, if we had to say what was our mission statement or thesis, is that we really wanted to center the content creator. We didn't want someone to have to know how to write HTML to create something beautiful. We really wanted things to be easy for our people doing the work within the CMS. Now, throughout this process, again, this really speaks to a lot of the collaborative nature of our work, but we really honed in on a solution that I think met two different needs, kind of the needs of IT and our marketing group. So we kind of had this balance. We had some very kind of strict or narrowly created content types or page templates that I think a lot of our more experienced web developers understood those weren't going to meet all of our different needs. But we also we have this paradox of choice, where if we give someone a blank canvas, they're just going to start typing in there, and it won't be designed. It won't necessarily look good. And if you give too many choices between components, they won't necessarily have good guidance on which ones are good to use and in what context. So we really iterated to develop a system that would just gently guide content creators towards making content that was focused, that would be a good web page that was focused on user experience. So this is really just this tension between structure versus versatility that played out in this process. So we have some pages that are very carefully designed, very strict layouts. They'll always have the same fields. And the design really restricts what content you can put on that type of page. And then we have more freeform pages that are just completely versatile, but they may be inconsistent. But that page can grow around whatever your content may or may not be. So
I think I moved you forward sooner than you meant. This is the next slide.
you're good. So we had we built a number of content types of varying levels of structure. But because those didn't necessarily align with our marketing group's vision for page templates, we also expanded this idea of clonable starter pages or clonable templates that would take one of these kind of more broad content types like a landing page or a content page and fill in all the blanks beforehand. So this would kind of be an example of how someone could use a landing page to create the homepage of their site. So one method we adopted to try to make to get the best of both worlds, we adopted this idea of components. So they're really just reusable snippets or chunks that are completely functional. Things like a call to action or a card group or a social media section, maybe an embedded form. These could all be examples of components. So within our different page templates, you get to pick and choose and shop and rearrange those elements within a page. So each of those components is structured, but your particular use of them may be more closely guided. The Drupal module that we embraced for this component development is called paragraphs. We didn't like the use of the word paragraphs. It felt very overloaded as like a wall of text. So we've called it many things, including sections and slices, and but all of our page headers and all of our different components were built out using that module, and some of them are nested within each other. And yeah, those are all built out within the Drupal interface and saved in the Drupal configuration, and then we write those templates.
The next few slides, I just wanted to go over real quick. These are just kind of reinforcing some of these ideas that we've talked about so far, so that as we go on, it'll make a little more sense. So like with the structured content, like this is an example of our person profile page or something like that, where we had this structured content. We do have these items in our CMS that are basically fill in the form, and we format it and we output it for you, and that's it. This is more of the approach that we came to, that we feel like really turned a corner on allowing our content creators to kind of flex their creativity a little bit more and really do more, feel like they're actually creating something nice and modern and cool looking, where you can have as many of these different components on one page, or slices or sections or whatever you want to call them. You can just keep adding them into it, and you can have different ones. Some have a few columns, some have some photos, some have some lists, and so on and so forth. And then the alternative was, and this is still a valid way to do it in some cases. Like if you have people who are particularly fond of working in HTML, then this is very appealing. But this is kind of what it was before, where you have just like this big empty box that you can just fill in. And sometimes you have a sidebar over here that you can also do. So this idea of those components was kind of to bridge the gap between these two approaches and give our users something more to do.
So yeah, our collaborative process helped us collapse, I think, 8 original page designs down, and we broke that up into 6 clonable starter pages. And each of those starter pages were built with 3 content types. So each of these templates and content types were sort of built as like a breadcrumb or funnel so we could incrementally train our site creators on how to use these different components. And as they can use them more effectively, they grow into power users, and they stop using the clonable templates because they know how to build stuff. And then everybody's using the kitchen sink, which doesn't have any guidelines. You can use any component in any arrangement or place, and it gives you that freedom.
Sorry about that. Didn't advance it for you.
So all of our different content types and page types within CMS Sunflower, this is the name of our code name for our Drupal 8 instance, kind of falls somewhere on this spectrum. So our person profile, it has all the same fields, always the same layout, just a couple different presentation views. Our clonable templates give a little bit more structure. And our landing and content page content types kind of try to guide users toward making good choices, whereas the kitchen sink gives complete freedom to use components however they'd like to use them. And we did include a WYSIWYG page so that if someone wants to write HTML in a field, that they have that power.
Before I move on, Adam, I just want to make sure you know too, we have about 3 minutes left until we need to break for questions. So I got to put my moderator hat on here for a second.
All right. Thanks, Chris. So one of the first steps when you log into your new CMS Sunflower site, you want to create a page, clone a template. That should give you guidance on how you can build a page. You could also start with a landing page content type. So start with a template, clone that template. So here's an example of a clone template. So it's got lorem ipsum, blank images. You just swap out the pieces that you want and save it, and you've got a new page that should look pretty good. Or if you're starting with a blank page, we use this module called the paragraphs browser module. So you've got screenshots kind of telling you what a component may look like, and you can shop through this to kind of scroll down and interact with all the different elements that are available to you. And here's kind of broken down. Here's I think I've heard this referred to as a skyscraper method as well. So all these different components stacked on top of each other. This kind of breaks it out into its discrete units.
I also wanted to mention too that this is a shameless plug for my own school, that I tend to be like I'm a dedicated resource for the business school. But the reason why I wanted to do this shameless plug is because I wanted to point out the fact that I had nothing to do with any of this. This was all done by our communications director and our communications coordinator. They built all these pages out using these components, and they look fantastic. And I mean, normally for design issues and things like that, I would have to be way more involved, but this gives me time to work on other things now, more other tasks that require my developer skills more. So, all right, look at that. We're right on time for questions. And let me check the Q&A here. So approximately how many people were working on this project in Marcom and then on the IT side? That's a good question. So I'll let Adam take this one.
Yeah, so I think at any given time, there were at least 2 on the marketing team, 100% devoted on this project, plus a project manager on their side. And they had other people moving in and out on various cycles as their project loads shifted around. So I'd say probably 3 or 4 on the Marcom side. On the IT side, we have a really interesting structure in terms of not all of our developers were able to commit 100% of their efforts to this. So we probably had, shoot, I can scroll the list of the people in this chat and identify probably 10 roughly developers.
Yeah, I'd say at least.
And probably 3 or 4 of them committed completely to this at any given time.
Yeah, I was really lucky because with our in the business school, again, I'm very fortunate. We have a great communications team there that I work with, and they just kind of suspended new things because they knew that I was going to be pulled into this, and they were very excited for it. So that was their way of kind of saying like, hey, we support you, go help with this, like, go, let's make it happen. And so they kind of, and they also were very proactive in getting started redesigning reorganizing the business school site and doing a lot of that work. So there was a few of us that were able to kind of give ourselves kind of almost wholly to the project, and then some that we had to tap as as we needed them. So David Burke had a question about, did we validate the user experience of each component before adding it to the design system with usability testing or other valid research methods? That would be a good question for the Marcom folks, and that's only because they're the ones that made the designs and then passed them off to us. But they did do a lot of user research ahead of the project. I don't know if they did user research for individual pieces as they were designing them, as they were actually adding them into the system to say like, yes, this is what we're going with. I personally, my feeling is that I feel like maybe we could have done a little bit more to get some of this stuff in front of the users before it was time to actually deploy the system out to the first early adopters. That if you asked me things that I would have done differently, that's one of the first things I'll tell you, is that I wish that we could have got this in hands of real users. The whole system, as just period. I wish we could have got the whole system in the hands of real users earlier before we deployed.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident we didn't do any user experience testing with components once they were built, but it'd be something worth back testing and iterating upon. So
it'd be cool too if at some point, and Adam, I don't know if this is possible or not. You might know this, but if at some point we can actually analyze which components are being used the most and how they're being used.
That's a good idea for generating a report like that. Anonymous asks, how did you transfer content? Was it building of each page, and if so, who built those out? So we did not support the automatic or automated transfer of content. Each
on
page,
purpose.
This was intentionally. There was some desire for departments, site and content owners to use this as an opportunity to restructure their pages. The people doing that work was generally the departments themselves. So we'd work with their communications person, or often an admin assistant, or someone who's invested in the website to build that out. We have training sessions available, and they would build out each page. We do offer services to build those out. Our student developers help with that. In some cases, we can migrate content directly over, especially really highly structured content, like person profiles. We do have a module or a mechanism for that, which speeds things up if it's predictable and doesn't really need content analysis. So
yeah, I mean, it was a heavy lift for them to have to go through and recreate their sites. But in a lot of cases, the previous site and the fact that most of the pages were built with these WYSIWYG controls, we ended up with these giant walls of text, or giant walls of really dense text, or really poorly formatted pages. I mean, there was a lot of just crud out there that really.
I made some of that crud.
Yeah, we all did. I mean, we all are guilty of it too. And we realized, that it was a kind of a heavy lift for some people, especially the ones that Adam mentioned, like the admin assistants and people that weren't necessarily, whose jobs weren't 100% communications or web development. But it just was something that we felt like needed to be done. That, and the fact that there wasn't an easy migration path to begin with. Now in the future, going from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9, like we said, this is going to probably happen over the weekend. And it'll be before people even, hopefully people won't even notice, if everything goes well, no one will even know it went to 9. So getting it reset now for this, like getting it cleaned up and reset, means that hopefully we don't have to do that again as we upgrade, because in the future we could possibly upgrade in ways where it's not really felt, other than maybe a design change or some branding and other look changes. But all right, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I'll let you take this one first if you like. If you'd go back in time and do something differently on this project, what would it be?
Let's see, what would it be? Definitely testing. Definitely getting it in the hands of people ahead of the deployment. Like, I would have loved to. I would have
User
loved
experience
to
testing?
Yeah, user experience testing. Sorry, I would have loved to have given this to my communications director at the school business and let her play around with it beforehand, because she's one of our power users, but she's also, very smart about how she, does this stuff. And I think it would have been great to see how she would have done things. I think it might have provided some good insights. Yeah. What about you, Adam? Do you have?
I'm just curious if on that level, if there are like what other user experience research and testing people do. I was curious if David Burke, who'd asked that question, had recommendations or tools. But no, I think going back, what I would have done differently, I think in the very beginning, I would have devoted a little bit more time to skilling up the whole team, maybe done a retreat with some sessions, because Drupal is a kind of complicated technology. There's a lot to learn between the modules, the theming, the hooks, and everything in between. So I think developing more time to professional development and getting that technological foundation across the entire team would have been beneficial. We talked about it in the beginning, but could never find the time. And then one of our big barriers right now is just we don't have a test pipeline. So maintaining our test pipeline from the beginning, we had a small one early in the process, but it stopped working, and we weren't able to commit the resources to getting all that working again.
Well, thank you everybody for attending. We've run over a few minutes here, so I don't want to keep you any longer. Since you have a 15-minute break, well, 12 minutes now, sorry, before the next session at 4 o'clock. If you have any questions for us, our emails are here. I apologize for having to look at the side of my head so much, but my camera that they gave me on my monitor here was shooting at the top of my head, so I figured side of my head or top of my head that this is probably better of the two options. But thank you again for all your questions and for coming and listening. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Chris.